Big 12 needs some big help. Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, breaking down the game we love each and every day, 24/7, 365. So please lock it in after you check out the videos, and we prove to be worth the subscription here on YouTube. Lock it in. Like, comment, share the videos, and, of course, subscribe. All right, let's talk Big 12 football. And, of course, the huge one coming up Saturday night in Waco. Baylor, undefeated, hosting one-loss Oklahoma. This is what has transpired to date. We're going to give our most favorable scenario for the Big 12 and our least favorable within reason. Sure, everybody could beat everybody, and we could have a 9-4 Big 12 champion. We're talking about reasonable scenarios, both on the best case scenario side for the Big 12 and the worst. What has happened to date is that the worst game for the Big 12 thus far has been the Kansas State win over Oklahoma. That has damaged the conference more than any other game this season. Oklahoma otherwise would, of course, be undefeated. They were ranked by the College Football Playoff Selection Committee at number 9 last week. That would be a few spots higher, if not in the top 5. So they would be in prime position to win the conference as an undefeated team, if not the loss against Kansas State 48-41 as a 24-point favorite. So that's the loss that really hurts, pardon the pun, for Oklahoma. Texas not meeting expectations has hurt the Big 12 as well. Most of us expected Oklahoma and Texas to play twice this year and for those two teams to be vying for college football playoff appearances. That has not been the case. Texas has fallen to 6-3. What has worked in the Big 12's favor has been that there could be complete cannibalization by now, that they have tight-roped walk, meaning Baylor, their way to a 9-0 start. Baylor could have easily lost to Iowa State. They could have lost to Texas Tech, a very marginal team. They won that game in overtime. They beat TCU this past Saturday in triple overtime, a game that they could have lost 18 different ways, and were very fortunate to come out of that one. Actually, a blade of grass by the TCU quarterback between he and the sideline in stepping out of bounds potentially could have been the difference between Baylor not sustaining its way to another overtime. And they also barely beat a mediocre West Virginia team at home, 17-14. That game could have been lost very easily. So there's been a play or two in 4 or 5 games that could make Baylor not just not undefeated, but a 5-4 team. For Oklahoma, that game against Iowa State last weekend could have collapsed the Big 12 as well, because Oklahoma most likely is going to win at least one of 2 matchups against Baylor, which would doom the Big 12 had they lost on a 2-point conversion try by Iowa State at the gun, a game that Oklahoma dominated for a half to 3 quarters and imploded in the fourth quarter, getting outscored 20-0 by Iowa State and escaping on the 2-point conversion try that was missed, 42-41. So either Baylor losing any one of those games or Oklahoma losing to Iowa State this past weekend could have doomed the Big 12. But the Big 12 is still barely alive. Best case scenario for the Big 12, and this is a reasonable expectation here, is that plainly that Baylor just wins out. They would be an undefeated Power 5 champion. And despite not gaining much respect to date, they would have beaten Oklahoma, of course, twice to do it. They would beat them this coming Saturday and also beat them in the Big 12 championship game to finish 13-0. A 13-0 Power 5 champion is not going to miss the college football playoff, despite Baylor's near misses and lack of impressive play and abysmal, deplorable, awful, embarrassing, shameful non-conference schedule that includes 3 teams with, as of a couple weeks ago, 4 wins. Atrocious. The next best case scenario for the Big 12 to get into the college football playoff would be Oklahoma defeats Baylor twice. Oklahoma sweeps. And they don't make Baylor look too awful in those 2 wins. Otherwise, Baylor's going to be completely dismissed, and the rest of the Big 12 as well. let's say Oklahoma makes Baylor look decent, but beats them soundly, beats them 31-20, beats them 41-31. That would be the best case scenario. Next in line for the Big 12 would be Oklahoma defeats Baylor twice to finish at 12-1. All right. Worst case scenario for the Big 12, again, off the top, I outlined it, that there's just complete chaos and teams beat each other. And we've seen where Oklahoma and Baylor both are capable of being beaten by just about anybody in the conference. So that could happen. We could have a 3-loss Big 12 champion. I would not be surprised. But within reason, the worst case scenario is that Baylor beats Oklahoma this Saturday night. Then Oklahoma comes back and beats them in the championship game. Any split between the two teams, especially on the Oklahoma side, is not a good thing for the Big 12. As a 2-loss Oklahoma champion in the Big 12 championship game, not good for the Big 12. Baylor, on the other hand, could rebound from an Oklahoma loss, avenge the loss, much like the Sooners did against the Longhorns last year. And as a 12-1 Big 12 champion, avenging its loss, maybe Baylor makes it into the playoff. Or, as we just outlined, with both of these teams being and showing themselves to be very vulnerable against mid-tier teams in the Big 12, they could lose other games. Baylor has 2 games against Texas and at Kansas. Don't laugh at Kansas. Kansas took Texas to the wire. So Baylor could lose either one of those games and still win the Big 12 championship and the playoffs out the door. Oklahoma still has to deal with TCU and Oklahoma State in Stillwater, and we know that the Cowboys have been very capable on occasion. So Oklahoma could wipe out Baylor twice, but find itself with a loss against the TCU or against an Oklahoma State. Is that likely? Not necessarily. They'll be a full 3-touchdown favorite, something in that range against TCU, probably in the 14 to 17 point range. I would think against TCU at home, and against Oklahoma State on the road, maybe more in the 10 to 14 point range. All right. So the Big 12 has 3 avenues. Number 1 is Baylor sweeps. They're 13-0. They get into the playoff without a doubt. The second path for the Big 12 to get into the college football playoff would be for Baylor to lose to Oklahoma, win the rest of its games, and avenge that Big 12 championship game loss to finish at 12-1. Baylor, the Big 12 champion, avenges its loss to Oklahoma, and they're in the playoff. And point number 3 would be Oklahoma sweeps. So they get themselves into the championship game with a win over Baylor, and then they beat Baylor again, and Oklahoma stands at 12-1. What's going to happen? There are going to be upsets in college football, and there is no other conference that is more prone to the upset this year because their top teams, Baylor and Oklahoma, have not proven dominant. They have not been dominant. Clemson versus the rest of the ACC is obvious. Ohio State versus the rest of the Big Ten, even though they've got tough games against Penn State, Michigan in the Big Ten championship game. Oregon, Utah, despite them separating themselves in the Pac-12, it would not be a shock if either one of those teams lost another game. But there is little separation between Baylor and Oklahoma based on what they've shown and the rest of the Big 12. Based on name brand, we all feel and think it feels like Oklahoma should win this thing, that they should win the rest of their games. But based on the football that's being played on the field against the likes of Kansas State and Iowa State, Oklahoma is not separating itself from the rest of the Big 12. So don't be surprised if this happens. And here's the bold prediction. Oklahoma sweeps Baylor. Good news for the Big 12, right? Oklahoma's there at 12-1. Oklahoma sweeps Baylor, but they lose the Big 12 finale in Stillwater against arch rival Oklahoma State. So Oklahoma finishes as the Big 12 champion at 11-2, and the Big 12 is out of the college football playoff. My thoughts on the Big 12 and the various paths to the college football playoff. Would love to hear from you. Get your comments down in the comments section of what you think is going to happen with Oklahoma Baylor this Saturday night and the Big 12 race down the stretch. Right here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Please like, comment, share the videos, and subscribe.